Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us for the July NEMSIS Tax State Training webinar. This webinar is intended for state and territory EMS data managers and their representatives. We appreciate the time that you set aside today to join us for the call. Today our presenter is Mr. Josh Legler. Many of you know Josh, but for those of you who do not, he was a former state EMS data manager here in Utah, and he is now currently in Oregon, and he serves as a contractor for the NEMSIS Technical Assistance Center. He will be sharing information with us today on this fantastic topic of demographic data, specifically related to the version 3 standard. And I'll now turn the time over to Josh Legler.
Okay, great. Thank you, Monet, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm actually impressed at how many people are on the call on July 5th, morning after Independence Day. So congratulations to all of you for being at work today to join this call. I'm going to be covering this topic of agency demographic data today. Have a couple things I'll show you in slide format, and then we're going to review the demographic data guide that's available on the NEMSIS website and was rewritten a couple of years ago. And we're going to review that guide and look at some of the topics that it covers as it relates to agency demographic data. We will wrap up with a brief discussion or overview of some proposed changes in the demographic data set for NEMSIS version 3.5. We should have plenty of time for questions as well. You can feel free to speak up with questions as we go, and I'll leave time at the end as well. All right, so here's our agenda. First, I want to address this topic of why agency demographic data is a key to data quality. Then we'll switch over to the NEMSIS demographic data guide and look at guidelines and requirements for systems sending and receiving demographic data. We'll also discuss issues in processing demographic data, as well as solutions to those issues. There are issues with products in the field today in their processing of demographic data, but there are ways to solve those issues. And then, as I mentioned, we'll finish up with some proposed changes for NEMSIS 3.5. All right, so I first want to make the case that demographic data is key to data quality in your state data systems. Let's look at a couple simple examples. Most of your states have a state configuration called state data set. And in that state data set, you've published information about the resources and requirements of your state. That allows agencies to set up their local software systems correctly to match the environment of your state. And the information that they set up in their systems then becomes information that you see in patient care reports. For example, in your state data set, you may have a list of licensure levels that are recognized in your state. Many states recognize these new 2009 licensure levels, EMR, EMT, AEMT, and paramedic. Some states have additional levels as well. But let's say that those are the 4 levels that your state recognizes. Well, when an agency sets up its agency configuration in its software, it needs to know which license levels to turn on. In this example I'm giving here, let's say that the agency has turned on the EMT basic and EMT paramedic licensure levels. Those are the old levels from the 80s and 90s. Well, there's a disconnect here between the levels that the state recognizes and the levels that that agency has set up in their system. Now, what's going to happen when they do patient care reports? Well, when they fill out patient care reports and they list crew members who were on a call, they might have Mr. Doe and Ms. Smith, and the levels for those crew members are going to be the levels that they set up in their agency configuration. So you're going to have EMT basic and EMT paramedic, and you could potentially have that problem, that incorrect data, on lots of records as they get listed on all these different patient care reports. Now, Ms. Smith, she might only run a few calls a year. It might be several months before she gets listed on a call in a patient care report and someone catches the fact that her level was wrong, that it was EMT paramedic when it should have been a 2009 paramedic. It may take months before that issue actually pops up and gets caught in patient care reports. But an agency exports its demographic data using the NEMSIS DEM dataset standard. And in the DEM dataset, they will list the licensure levels that the agency has, and they'll list each of the personnel on their personnel list. So Ms. Smith, while she may only run a few calls a year, she's on the personnel list in demographic data. And in there, she would be listed as EMT paramedic, which would be wrong because the state recognizes the 2009 paramedic level. So the demographic data set would be the best place to catch this issue because that's where you've got the complete personnel list in one document, and you find in that one document that the agency has implemented the incorrect levels according to what your state recognizes. You can catch it right there in demographic data set before the first patient care report has ever been created. So you fix the data quality issue right at the beginning if you look at demographic data. Let's look at another example. How about facilities? In your state dataset document, you can have a list of facilities that your state recognizes. And let's say, for example, that you have a facility called Shriners Hospital, and it has facility code 872261. And so that's the code that your state has assigned to that hospital. Shriners Hospital is the name that you recognize for that hospital. Well, what if the agency sets it up and they just come up with their own code for their facilities? They call it SHR for the facility code. And the name of the facility, they just call it Shriners, no apostrophe before the S and no hospital at the end. Well, of course, what's going to happen then is every time they go on a patient care, go on a call and fill out a patient care report, every time they transport to that destination, the patient care report is going to use the code and the name that the agency set up in their system. Now, again, it might be a low volume destination. It might be several weeks or months before they go to that destination on a patient care report, before you see a patient care report that has that incorrect information. Or it might be a destination that they go to several times every day. And just in the course of a week, you could have dozens of patient care reports with incorrect code and incorrect name for that destination. That could create a lot of data that needs to be fixed after the fact as those patient care reports pile up. So again, where's the best place to catch this problem? It's in their agency demographics setup, their DEM data set document. There you can have the agency export the list of facilities that they serve. And in one document, you get the complete list of all the facilities they serve. And you see, for example, that they have this facility called Shriners with a code of SHR. That's a facility that's not on your state list. You look into it and you see that, it's actually this facility here, Shriners Hospital, 872261. You have the agency update their setup before they even create their first patient care report. And then you're confident that when they go on calls, it's very likely that they'll have the correct code and the correct name of that destination whenever they use it for a call. So demographic data becomes this key to data quality because it's the link and it's where you verify a correct link has been established between the information that your state published about your resources and requirements and the information that the agency actually put in and set up in their system that's going to then feed to all of their PCRs. So it's that key. If you can evaluate the data quality of demographic data up front, then you can prevent lots of data quality issues down the road in PCRs. Other areas this would come into play would be medication codes and procedure codes, would be protocols that the agency uses compared to protocols that the state allows to be used. So those things, they can be caught in the demographic data up front. So that's kind of my 5-minute pitch on why demographic data is key to data quality in your EMS data systems. I want to pause for a second here and ask if you have any questions or comments on this topic here. Okay, all right. Well, let's now kind of switch gears, and we're going to look at the demographic data guide. And just a second here, because I think we have someone who's unmuted. Background noise. Doug again. Doug?
Hi.
Hi. Can you mute yourself when you're not talking?
I can. I just had a quick question, Josh.
Oh, yeah. Okay,
Does
go ahead.
any of this get stopped along the way in a schematron or anything like that if something's not set up correctly so the jump doesn't move forward?
Yeah, if you create schematron rules for demographic data, then when the agency submits their demographic data to your state system, your system could accept or reject their data based on rules that you've set up. Of course, you could make errors or warnings, depending how you want to handle that. So for example, in work that I do with the state of Oregon, Oregon has a state schematron file for demographic data. And it checks several things. It does check facility codes. So if they have a hospital on their facility list that has a code that the state doesn't recognize, then they'll get a schematron message about that. If they use levels that the state doesn't recognize, or if they use medication or procedure codes that the state doesn't recognize, some of those are errors, and some of those have been set up as warnings. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so let's switch over to the demographic data guide. First of all, where to find it on the NEMSIS website. Go to nemsis.org, technical resources, V3 guides and usage. Once you're on that page, you'll see a few links on the page. They're showing up here. And these last two links are related to demographic data. So the demographic data guide, which we're going to review today, and towards the end, I'll show you a sample schematron schema for testing some things in demographic data. All right, so let's start with the demographic data guide. This guide was originally written when NEMSIS 3 was first being developed, and then we did a complete rewrite of it about a year and a half ago, at the beginning of 2017. For that rewrite, you can see a whole list of contributors from states and vendors and agencies who helped with this guide. There's a few things I want to review in this guide, and here's the first one. Receiving and sending demographic data. Here's what the guide says are the requirements. An agency system should send demographic data to a state system before sending any PCR data. And state systems are required to send demographic data for each agency at least 24 hours prior to starting to send PCR data for that agency to the national EMS database. That's the initial push. Demographic data then should be resent whenever it gets updated in an agency system. It should be resent to the state system within 24 hours of any updates being made. At a minimum, it should be sent at least annually because agency demographic data includes a section for annual statistics. And as each year ends, the agency should enter their annual statistics for that previous year. So even if nothing changed in the agency, they didn't hire or fire any personnel or anything, they would still update their data at least annually in order to add the latest year of annual statistics. So that's why the requirement is at least annually. But realistically, practically speaking, agency demographic data probably gets updated, depending on the size of the agency. It may be daily to maybe monthly, maybe weekly, as personnel come and go, vehicles come and go, things like that. And so whenever it is updated, it should be pushed to the state system within 24 hours of the update. And the state system should push the national data onto the national database within 24 hours as well. we're not seeing very good compliance with this around the country. And in a moment, we're going to talk about some of the issues that are being seen that are causing problems in local and state systems. But what we are seeing is that we get the initial demographic data push, and then often we never see an update coming through. We would think that agencies are changing over time, that personnel, vehicles, et cetera, are coming and going over time. And it would be unusual to just see initial data from an agency and then go months or even years without seeing an update. We would expect those updates to happen from time to time. So that's something to keep in mind as you work with your state system vendor, and make sure that that can be that we can get good compliance there of going from local to state to national. Any questions there about that requirement? Okay. There's another concept here that has also been tricky and where we are seeing very poor compliance. Most of the data in agency demographic data comes from a local EMS agency. For example, the list of personnel, the list of medications they carry, et cetera. However, there are a few data elements that are actually about the state. Deconfiguration.01 through 05, these data elements are information about the state. What should happen is that every demographic data file sent from that state to the national database should have the exact same information for these 5 elements across all agencies, because it's information about the state, not the agency. Now, I'll note here that in NEMSIS 3.5, the proposal is to remove these elements from the agency demographic data set and to rely on state data set for these elements because of the recognition that these are information that's not specific to the agency. It's statewide information, and we don't need to have it in every agency's file. What we're currently seeing, though, is, again, poor compliance with these elements. Luckily, we have state data set now, and so we really rely on state data set for this information from 30 plus states who have submitted this information in their state data set. So we'll probably see a change in the requirements here as we move to NEMSIS 3.5. Okay, a related concept that is important to keep in mind is this concept of authoritative source or system of record. What I mean by that is that for each piece of information in a demographic data set, you could identify who is in charge of that information, who that information comes from. For example, take agency name. Well, in some states, agency name is probably something that is done through an application process with the state when the agency receives a license. And when they go through that licensing process, they fill out what their agency name is, and the state issues a license and has that agency name, that official agency name, on the agency's license. And in that case, the state really is the authoritative source of an agency's name. If the agency decides to change its name, they don't just simply change their name. They go to the state EMS office and say, we'd like to submit a name change for our agency. We have a new name. And the state would approve that and reissue the license with the new name for that agency. So in that case, then because the state has authority over what the name of the agency is, the state could be the authoritative source of that information or the system of record. In other states, that wouldn't be the case. In other states, the state may say agencies can call themselves whatever they want, and they can change their name whenever they want, and they don't have to get the approval or even notify the state. They can just do that. And in that case, then the agency would be the authoritative source or the system of record regarding the agency's name. Well, depending on who the authoritative source is, then that's where you want the data to come from. So if the state is the authoritative source of an agency's name, then you really don't want to receive agency demographic data and process the agency name in the data that you receive and just update your state system based on that. Because you're saying, no, the state system is actually the authoritative source of that information. So if the agency gives us a different name in their agency demographic data, we're going to ignore that. We've already got the official name of the agency in our state system. And if we ever export that demographic data, we're going to export it with the official name of the agency as the state system has it. Well, you can identify authoritative source not just for agency name, but for lots of other data elements within that demographic data set. So again, lots of those data elements, the agency is the authoritative source of the information. They need to tell you what that information is. But there are some data elements where the state is the authoritative source of the information. Essentially, you tell the agency what that data is. And if you've got it set up in your state system, then you don't want to allow the agency to overwrite or modify that data. The demographic data guide has an appendix towards the end that helps you kind of walk through the decision process of figuring out authoritative source or system of record. Now, how would that be implemented? You would talk with your state vendor and say, when demographic data comes into our state, here are the data elements that we want to process in that demographic data. And here are the elements that we want to ignore because we are the authoritative source of this information, not the agency. All right, so kind of a somewhat advanced topic there. Any questions or anything I could clarify on this idea of authoritative source or system of record? Okay. All right, so a big issue that we are seeing across the country in state systems is issues with processing demographic data received from agencies that are using systems other than the state system. What's happening is they submit their demographic data to the state system processes it, and after it's done processing, the state data manager logs in and notices that there's now a whole bunch of duplicates in an agency setup. For example, if they go to the devices page or a devices list for that agency, the list of medical devices, and as the agency submits demographic data, say they submit it once a day, and from time to time their device list changes. They buy a new one, they get rid of an old one, maybe they correct an error on the name of one of their devices, whatever. And as those changes happen, what happens in the state system is that this device list essentially bloats over time. And whenever the agency gets rid of a device, it doesn't go away in the state system. It stays there. And you get this bloated device list that has a bunch of duplicates, duplicate records, has a bunch of devices that are no longer used by the agency, and it gets worse over time. Well, this problem can be solved. And the demographic data guide actually spends several pages talking about this very problem because we recognized that it was such an issue in state systems that are being used today. So the demographic data guide actually goes through 3 different approaches to processing demographic data coming in from agencies. I'm going to briefly just describe kind of a high-level overview of what these 3 approaches are. The technical details of these approaches are things that your vendors should be looking at. But I think it's helpful for you to be conversant on just the high-level view, the high-level kind of goals of these different approaches. Remember that end objective is to make sure that your state system accurately reflects what the agency sent to you. Okay, so one way that a state system can process incoming demographic data is through a simple delete and insert approach. The way this works is, let's say you get submission number 1 from an EMS agency. This is the first time that they've ever submitted data in NEMSIS 3. And their submission includes a list of 3 medical devices, DFib 1, 2, and 3. Well, this is the first ever data received from that agency. The state system processes through it and goes ahead and inserts those 3 medical devices into that agency in the state system. So then at the end, you've got DFIB 1, 2, and 3, all as 3 new records that were inserted into the state system. Now, what happens when submission number 2 comes in? Let's say the agency got rid of DFIB 1 and they purchased DFIB 4. So now they have DFIB 2, 3, and 4 in their agency system. So they submit data to the state system, and that's what they submit. They submit this list of 3 devices. Well, and then also for DFIB 2, they changed the device manufacturer's name. Well, what does the state system do? In this approach, the state system simply deletes or marks as inactive the 3 existing records that it had for devices in that agency, and it simply inserts 3 new records that represent the current snapshot of the device list for that agency. So that's one way that you can do it, and I've listed some pros and cons to that approach. All right, approach number 2, delete, insert, and update. Okay, so we start out the same. Submission number 1 has these 3 devices, DFIB 1, 2, and 3. On that first submission, then the state is going to insert 3 records into its system. It'll match what the agency provided. We're good at that point. Submission number 2 comes in. They got rid of DFIB 1. They added DFIB 4. They changed the manufacturer's name on DFIB 2. With this second approach, what the state system would do is it would actually look through its existing records and compare them to what it just received from the agency. So it would look at DFIB 1, and it would see that DFIB 1 no longer exists in the agency data. So it would delete or inactivate that record in the state system. It would look at DFIB 2 and see that DFIB 2 does in fact exist in this new submission from the agency. It would recognize that the manufacturer's name doesn't match anymore, so it would update the manufacturer's name in the state system. It would look at DFIB 3 and see that it still exists in the agency's list and that nothing has changed. And then it would look and see that the agency has a new record for DFIB 4 that does not exist in the state system, so it would go ahead and insert a new record to represent DFIB 4. So that's the second approach, doing insert, update, delete type approach. And I've listed pros and cons to that approach as well. Well, the third approach the vendor's product could use is a versioning approach. This uses concepts from the data warehousing world. Okay, so we have submission number 1 with these 3 defibrillators. And on that initial submission, the state system simply inserts 3 records. However, it has 2 new attributes for each record, a from date and a to date. So here's what happens when you get submission number 2. Submission number 2 gets rid of DFIB 1, it adds DFIB 4, it keeps DFIB 2 and 3. So what we see in the state system when it processes this data, it looks at DFIB 1 and finds that it's no longer in the submission for that agency. What it does is it doesn't delete the record, but it simply puts today's date as the end date of effectiveness for that record. So in other words, that device existed in that agency from the time we first got data up until this day when we discovered that it no longer exists in the agency. DFIB 2 still, here we have DFIB 2 still in data, but some information about it has changed. So what the state system does is it puts an end date on its existing record for DFIB 2, and it inserts a new record for DFIB 2 that contains the new manufacturer info. And then it puts a start date on that record. So you have historical insight here. You know that up until September 27th, DFIB 2, they had a manufacturer name of Acme. But starting on September 27th, DFIB 2 had a manufacturer name of Acme Inc. Now, in this case, probably not very important to know that, but there are other areas like in personnel where if someone changed licensure levels, it may be very important to keep history for that personnel and to know that prior to this date, they were an EMT, but starting on this date, they became an advanced EMT. Okay, and then DFib-4 is a new record, so DFib-4 gets entered in as a new device, and it has a start date because it did not exist prior to that date in the agency. And there are pros and cons to that third approach as well, that data warehousing approach. So again, simplest approach, number one, is where the state system simply, whenever it gets an update, it deletes everything it has, and then it just inserts everything that it got. This is how systems are perhaps processing updates to patient care reports today. So agency submits a new version of a patient care report. The state system simply archives or deletes the old version of the report, everything in that report, and inserts the new version, everything new. Approach number two, recognizing what changed and deleting, updating, or inserting as needed. And then approach number three, the data warehousing approach, where we maintain historical insight by assigning start and end dates to every version of a record as it comes in. Okay, so that's a fairly advanced topic. I wanted you to have that high-level overview of how state systems, how the vendors of state systems can approach the processing of demographic data in ways that allow them to avoid getting a whole pile of duplicates or garbage data in the state system. The technical details, again, are something for your vendor, for their developers to really take a look at and go through those details. But I wanted you to have that high-level view of how they can approach the problem and to know that the problem is solvable. It can be taken care of. When you get duplicate data in your state system, that's not a problem that's inevitable that you have to live with. It's a problem that can be solved through this sort of process approach. I want to pause here, see if there are questions or comments. I know some of you on the call have run into this issue of getting duplicate data in your state system, and I would be interested if you have any questions or comments on these approaches. Okay, so far not. All right. So as you work with your vendor, remind them of the demographic data guide and remind them that these approaches are outlined here, that they've got some information they can use to help make this happen. There's one additional note as we look through, let me go up to the example here, like this last one. In order for this approach, in order for the second and third approach to work, it's important that the data coming in has at least enough information for each of these devices to identify the device. Let's say, for example, that one of these devices didn't have a serial number or it didn't have a name. And so all you know is it's an AED, but you don't know which one it is. Then it's really hard for this approach to work because we don't have a unique identifier for each device. So if you use the second or third approach here, then it's really important to also deploy some schematron rules in your state that require unique identifiers. And so, for example, if you got device serial number 10101, and then there was another device down here that also had serial number 10101, you would reject the submission because you have two different medical devices with the same serial number. That means they're not unique. Is it the same device, or is it actually two different devices and someone put in the wrong serial number for one of them? You don't know how to handle it. So you can put in schematron rules that require serial number to be there if devices are included, and require the serial number to be unique within the list so that you can use it as a key, and then all of these things work, these approaches work. So in the data guide, that's this section about enforcing unique identifiers. That's what that's talking about. Okay, there are two appendices in this demographic data guide. First one is about authoritative source, as I mentioned. So this provides guidance for state systems looking at each of the different sections within demographic data and talking about considerations for figuring out which system would be the authoritative source. Is it the local agency system and you process the data that comes in? Or is it the state system and you don't process the data that comes in from the agency for that data element or that section? So that's Appendix A. Appendix B talks about these unique identifiers that we mentioned a moment ago. And so for each section within demographic data, it identifies the data element that we would recommend should be used as the unique identifier for that section. So for a simple example, agency year group for agency statistics, you can use statistical calendar year, eAgency.15 as the key. If you got two groups of agency statistics and they both had the same year, 2017 for example, then that would be ambiguous. Do you take the numbers from the first 2017 group or do you take the numbers from the second 2017 group? If there's any differences between the two, something's wrong because 2017 only happened once and there should only be one set of statistical data for 2017. So you can use that as the unique key and make sure that it is always unique and always recorded. So again, if you got agency statistics with no calendar year at all, you would reject that as well because you need to know what year those stats actually applied to. So this appendix goes through all the sections of demographic data set and identifies what you could use as the unique key for each of those objects. So that's down to the end there. Now, related to that second appendix is the sample schematron code for enforcing unique identifiers. You'll see some sample code here that illustrates a schematron file that could be written that requires a unique identifier for medical devices, and it also requires that the unique identifier that it be unique within the list, that there's no duplicates. So it has to be present and it has to be unique. There's a full sample schematron schema available. Go back over to the NEMSIS website. That's this link here that will give you the full schematron schema for enforcing uniqueness constraints. And so it provides that schematron code not only for devices, but for personnel, facilities, vehicles, unit call signs, etc. Okay. I want to pause here. The next thing I'm going to talk about will be some proposed changes for NEMSIS 3.5. Before I do that, any questions on anything I've covered so far in the NEMSIS demographic data guide?
Josh, this is Clay. I'll just speak up here just real quickly and maybe just ask a second question related to that. Are there topics in this guide that folks feel like we could kind of revisit or simplify in some way, or are there topics related to the demographic data set that are not in here that folks would like to see some language added?
Okay, well, quiet. We're quiet today. We're still recovering from fireworks. Okay, well, let me briefly describe some two major proposed changes for NEMSIS 3.5 that affect demographic data. Proposal number 1 relates to state data set. And the proposal is that state data set, which is now an optional part of NEMSIS 3.4, would be adopted as a mandatory part of the NEMSIS 3.5 standard. And in compliance testing, state systems would be tested on their ability to correctly generate state data set document and to submit it through the standard NEMSIS 3 web services process to the national database. And then at the national database level, the national database would require that state data set information be submitted from a state before any agency data or patient care report data is submitted. Along with that, then we would remove some data elements from the demographic data set and even the EMS data set, data sets, because they are information about the state, not about the agency, not about the patient care report. And so that simplifies and reduces the number of data elements in demographics and patient care report data set. The other major proposal for NEMSIS 3.5 that I'm sure many of you have heard about is the addition of a UUID, or universally unique identifiers. They're also called globally unique identifiers, or GUIDs. This is to deal with that issue where I showed you as data changes over time, we need to be able to track those changes and make sure that the state system stays synchronized with what the agency system provided. And all of the approaches, those three approaches that I showed you today, can be done today using NEMSIS 3.4 or even 3.3.4. You can add some schematron rules to your state rules that enforce unique identifiers using existing data elements like device ID or personnel license number or facility ID. And once you've enforced those unique IDs, then your state system can use them as the key for figuring out updates, insertions, deletions. However, it can be tricky still to identify those changes. Let's say, for example, that someone put in a medical device and they did provide a serial number for the device, but then they recognized that they had a typo in the serial number. So they changed the serial number of that device. Well, the state system, even a really smart state system, it's going to look like the old device went away and a new device got added because they changed the serial number. The key, the unique key changed. Well, the proposal with NEMSIS 3.5 is to introduce an attribute that would contain a universally unique identifier generated by the agency system. UUIDs are long strings of letters and numbers that look like this, and they are generated according to an algorithm that virtually ensures uniqueness without any coordination through a central coordinating body. So a piece of software can generate a unique ID, and that unique ID would never be generated by any other piece of software running on any other device in the universe. So it can generate these IDs, they're guaranteed to be unique, and then what happens with NEMSIS 3.5, if this proposal is implemented, is that that medical device, for example, it would have the information that the person in the agency typed in, like the serial number, name, manufacturer, purchase date, but it would also have a unique ID under the hood. The agency person would not see this unique ID. It would be auto-generated by their software system and attached to that device record, and it would never change. So then, even if they change the serial number of that device, well, the unique ID, the UUID, never changes. So when that data gets submitted to the state system will be able to use the UUID as the unique identifier for a medical device. And so then even if the agency changed every piece of information about that device, the state system would still know that it was that object that got changed. And so this will make it easier for state systems to process those updates. Now, when I say it'll make it easier, I'm implying two things. One, it's possible today for state systems to do a good job of processing updates in demographic data. We're not seeing it being done well, but it's possible to do it well, and the demographic data guide outlines how to do it. And number two, while it will be easier for state systems to process demographic data updates in version 3.5, the addition of a unique ID does not solve every single problem out there with recognizing updates. There's still things that have to be done even with these UUIDs in place. For example, one area that's particularly can be particularly challenging is the personnel list, and that's because the state really is the authoritative source on who personnel are and what their license numbers are and license levels and so on. The agency probably tells you who works for their agency, but the state knows what their license number is and everything else. And so usually when demographic data comes in from an agency, the state system needs to actually link that personnel record from the agency with some core personnel record or user record that exists in the state system that represents the license record for that person. So even with a unique a UUID being auto-generated at the agency level, it's still necessary for the state system to figure out who is the actual person that this is, who has been licensed by the state. And you've got to use things like name and license number, maybe birth date, to figure out that connection. So the UUID proposal will not solve every problem out there with processing demographic data, but it will simplify the process for state systems. So those are the two major proposals for NEMSIS 3.5. Okay, so that completes everything that I wanted to present to you, and we still have about 10 minutes remaining that we can cover questions and comments. And in particular, I would be especially interested in, those of you who have dealt with this issue in your state system of being able to receive and process demographic data from agencies and being able to rely on your state system actually giving you an accurate representation of the data that it received. I'd be interested in hearing the challenges that you've had, and maybe we can sort of identify the link between these challenges and these solutions that are contained here in the demographic data guide. So questions, comments, challenges, experiences, all of that, we've got the next 10 minutes to discuss.
Thanks, Josh. This was very informative.
Oh, thank you.
I personally don't know where in my system I can determine the unique identifier for a piece of equipment, so I have to talk with my vendor on that.
Yeah, right. That's a discussion to have with your vendor. If you take like medical devices,
Yes.
You can say, well, let's say that serial number is going to be our unique identifier. Or there's one called device ID. You could use that one. And once you've decided, then your vendor can implement and use that as the quote-unquote key for identifying devices.
Hey, Josh, this is Doug again.
Yes.
I'm really nervous about this state data set that you were talking about here a little bit ago that, for example, Nebraska does not establish protocols. We have a recommended set of protocols. It's all done locally. So as long as it fits a pattern, is that what you guys are going to be expecting?
Yeah, let's say in your state data set, state data set covers protocols as well as meds, procedures, agency list, facility list. Let's say your state regulates some of those things, but not other things. So protocols being an example of something your state doesn't regulate. So essentially, an agency may use whatever protocols it wants to use. So in your state data set, you could approach that two ways. One is you could just leave the protocol list blank. The state of Oregon has done that. They don't regulate which protocols agencies can use. They just don't even include a protocol list. So that means the agency can use any protocol that's defined in the NEMSIS standard. It's not limited by the state. The other way you could go is kind of the exact opposite of that. You could simply turn on, you could include the full list of protocols as a way of saying, hey, we recognize every protocol that's been defined in the NEMSIS standard.
Josh, are you still there?
Yes, I am. Yeah,
Oh.
other questions or comments?
Josh, this is Clay. If there's no other questions, maybe it would be valuable, just since the state data set is such an important part of the demographic file, is to just really briefly show people where they can access or build their state data set, and then where they can view others. May be helpful.
Okay. Yeah.
And the other thing I just thought I'd mention is it would be great to hear if any states are seeing some value in collecting the demographic data set in general, right? I think there's great potential value in lots of different arenas for collecting the demographic data set. We had one in version 2, but it was never kind of collected. But I think there's real value here in being able to look for adherence to protocols or performance of EMS, and I just wondered if any states had seen some beginnings of using the data in that way.
Okay. So first, for building your state data set, number one, on the data dictionaries page of the NEMSIS website, there is a data dictionary for state data set. So you can bring that up. Looks like EMS data set or DEM data set. So you can look through the different sections and see the different elements that can be in a state data set. That's one resource. And then you can use the state data set builder. It's under the View Reports menu, State Data Set Builder. There's a training webinar, a user guide to go with it. When you bring up the State Data Set Builder itself, then it will walk you through each of those different sections you can provide. So you can set up your custom data elements, determine which data elements your state requires to be submitted to the state. As a quick setup, you could choose all of the state recommended elements from the NEMSIS standard, and then you could go from there to uncheck any of the ones that you don't actually require, or add in the ones that you do. Work through the licensure levels that your state recognizes, like maybe you recognize the 2009 levels. Then you can look at procedures and medications that your state recognizes by licensure level. Start checking those off. Your protocol list, which protocols you recognize. Fill in the EMS agencies that are in your state. And then finally, facilities. There's a lot of information that you can provide about facilities in the state. So yeah, thoughts from all of you on receiving demographic data from agencies and how that could be useful for you.
In Wisconsin, because we've used the licensing program to maintain the demographic information, we've decided to just keep it based on their licensing information, because as you mentioned in an example earlier, they if they want to change their name or levels or anything like that, they have to have that approved by the office first. And so once that gets updated, then that information is ported to our EPCR program, which then uploads that information when it's changed.
Yeah, so that's great for the stuff where the state is the authoritative source and you know what's right, you know what's correct, and then where the agency demographic data submission from the agency can be helpful is for you to verify that the agency knows what's right, that the agency has correctly implemented the requirements you put out.
Yeah, the problem we've run into is those services that use a third-party program aren't as expeditious about getting into the program and making sure the information there is current.
Yeah, and then that impacts what you see on their patient care report data.
Yep.
So if they haven't added a new personnel, that might that person might show up with some generic license ID that
Yep.
is
Mm-hmm.
or something instead of the real person. Okay, other thoughts? Just a minute or two remaining, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, well, thanks to everyone for joining the call today. If you have follow-up comments or questions, there's my contact info. You can also send email to the NEMSIS TAC through the contact page on the NEMSIS website. And again, as a reminder, go to nemsis.org, resources menu, and V3 guides. That's where you'll find the demographic data guide and that sample schematron schema for uniqueness. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us on this 5th of July, and appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you. Take
Thank
care.
you, Josh.
Thank you, Josh.